They had already accepted the meals. They had adjusted to the quiet routines and the absence of constant control. What they had not prepared for was how often the coffee returned. At first, it seemed unimportant. A cup placed on the table, refilled without comment, offered again the next morning. No ration card was checked, no limit was announced, and no explanation followed. For men who had learned to associate coffee with scarcity, with moments carefully saved and measured, this repetition felt strange. Coffee was not meant to be ordinary. It was meant to be rare. As the cups continued to fill, uncertainty returned. Was this a temporary allowance, a test of restraint, or simply another rule they had not been told? No one answered, and the silence made the question harder to ignore. By the time coffee became part of daily life inside the camp, the prisoners had already learned one important lesson. Nothing here announced itself clearly. Routines formed quietly, without explanation, and revealed their meaning only through repetition. In the early days, coffee appeared almost casually. A metal cup placed beside a plate, filled without ceremony, and then refilled again when it was empty. No attention was drawn to it, and no instructions accompanied the gesture. The guards moved on, as if this detail required no notice at all. For many of the prisoners, coffee carried a different weight. Before their capture, it had been scarce, rationed, and often replaced with substitutes that barely resembled the real thing. It was associated with moments of pause, with brief relief carefully preserved rather than consumed freely. Here, however, it returned again and again, stripped of its former significance. At first, the men treated it with caution. Some drank only a small amount, stopping before the cup was empty. Others let it cool untouched, waiting to see whether limits would be enforced after the fact. The act of drinking became deliberate, shaped by habits formed under scarcity rather than abundance. The routine repeated the next morning, and a morning after that. Coffee appeared at the same time, in the same cups, refilled with the same quiet consistency. No corrections were made, and no reactions followed. This repetition unsettled the prisoners more than the drink itself. They had learned to read patterns as warnings, to interpret generosity as temporary, and to expect withdrawal to follow allowance. Yet nothing changed. The coffee returned, steady and unremarkable, as if it had always belonged there. Outside the dining hall, the camp followed its usual rhythm. Work details were assigned. Guards took their positions. Evenings settled without disruption. The presence of coffee did not alter the structure of the day, and that made it harder to understand its purpose. Some prisoners began to question whether this detail mattered at all. Perhaps it was simply part of American routine, not intended as a gesture or test. Others remained unconvinced, convinced that meaning would eventually reveal itself, if only they waited long enough. As days passed, hesitation slowly gave way to habit. Cups were emptied more quickly. Refills were accepted without pause. The act of drinking coffee became integrated into the rhythm of the day, no longer marked by suspicion, but by familiarity. Yet even as the routine settled, uncertainty remained. The prisoners did not understand why such a thing was allowed, or why it continued without comment. They only knew that it did. In a place where every detail had once carried consequence, the quiet presence of unlimited coffee became another reminder that captivity here did not follow the rules they had been taught to expect. And once again, the absence of explanation proved more unsettling than any restriction ever could. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. Inside the dining hall, the presence of coffee began to influence behavior in small, almost unnoticeable ways. No one spoke openly about it. There were no questions asked aloud and no conclusions shared with confidence. Instead, the prisoners watched, observed, and adjusted quietly, as they had learned to do throughout the war. At the tables, cups were placed in the same positions each day. They arrived already filled without comment and remained there until someone decided what to do with them. The guards did not draw attention to the cups, and they did not react when they were emptied. Refills happened naturally, as if the act required no approval. The men began to study each other more closely than before. They watched how quickly others drank, whether anyone refused a refill, and whether hesitation carried any consequence. Every movement was measured against the possibility that this routine would suddenly change. Some prisoners chose restraint. They drank slowly, stopping before the cup was empty, as if moderation itself offered protection. Others finished quickly, not out of eagerness, but to remove uncertainty as soon as possible. The coffee became less about taste and more about control. What unsettled many of them was not the amount, but the consistency. Coffee appeared in the morning, returned later in the day, and reappeared again without variation. There were no shortages, no substitutions, and no signs that supplies were being conserved. For men accustomed to scarcity, this consistency felt unnatural. They had learned that valuable resources were always temporary. Here, however, nothing suggested that limits were approaching. The guards continued their routines without change. They walked between tables, observed quietly, and moved on without comment. Their behavior offered no clues. They neither encouraged nor discouraged the prisoner's actions, leaving each man to interpret the situation alone. Conversations remained subdued. When the subject of coffee was mentioned, it was often done indirectly, through observation rather than opinion. Comments were cautious, framed as questions rather than statements. No one wanted to assume meaning where none had been confirmed. As the days passed, patterns began to form. The initial hesitation faded. Cups were accepted more readily. Refills were no longer met with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement. Yet even as familiarity grew, the underlying uncertainty did not disappear completely. The prisoners understood that routines in captivity could change without warning. They had seen allowances withdrawn before, often without explanation. The fact that coffee continued uninterrupted made it harder to predict what would come next. In this environment, even a simple drink became a source of reflection. It forced the men to confront the gap between what they expected captivity to be and what it was becoming. The coffee did not offer answers. It simply remained present and ordinary, asking a question no one could resolve. By the end of each meal, the cups were cleared without ceremony. Nothing dramatic followed. The prisoners returned to their routines, carrying with them the same quiet uncertainty they had felt before. In a place where every detail once demanded caution, the steady presence of coffee became another reminder that life in the American camps was governed by rules that were never spoken aloud. And as with so many aspects of this new captivity, the lack of explanation proved more unsettling than the act itself. As the days continued, the presence of coffee stopped demanding attention. What had once felt uncertain gradually became part of the background, woven into the rhythm of daily life inside the camp. The men no longer waited for an explanation. They adjusted instead. Mornings began to follow a familiar pattern. The same tables, the same cups, the same quiet movements as prisoners took their seats and prepared for the day ahead. Coffee appeared without announcement, just as it had before, and the absence of surprise marked a subtle shift in attitude. Hands reached for the cups more naturally now. Pauses grew shorter. The careful restraint that had once defined every movement began to ease, replaced by a cautious acceptance that this routine was not temporary. What had first been approached as a test slowly revealed itself as a constant. For many prisoners, this change was difficult to acknowledge openly. They had learned to remain alert, to question stability, and to expect sudden reversals. Yet repetition has a quiet power. When something returns unchanged day after day, it begins to shape expectations, even in the absence of trust. Coffee breaks became moments of stillness rather than tension. Men sat quietly, warming their hands on the cups, allowing themselves brief pauses that required no vigilance. Conversations, though still subdued, lasted a little longer. Silences felt less charged. The act of drinking no longer carried the weight of decision. It was no longer a question of how much was safe or whether restraint was required. It became something simpler, almost automatic, folded into the larger structure of the day. Outside the dining hall, the camp continued its routines without disruption. Work details were completed. Guards maintained their quiet presence. Evenings arrived without incident. Nothing about the wider system suggested that this small allowance would suddenly disappear. For some prisoners, this stability created an unexpected discomfort. They had prepared themselves for hardship, for deprivation that demanded endurance. Adapting to consistency required a different kind of effort. It meant letting go of constant anticipation and learning to exist within a system that did not announce its intentions. Others found relief in the predictability, not comfort, but a reduction in tension. The certainty that at least one part of the day would unfold as expected offered a small anchor in an otherwise uncertain environment. Still, the underlying question remained unresolved. Why was this allowed? Why did it continue without explanation? No answers came, and eventually the need for them diminished. As habit replaced doubt, the coffee lost its significance as an event. It became a marker of time rather than a source of confusion. Morning was defined by its presence, not by the questions it once raised. In this way, something ordinary took on a quiet importance, not because of what it represented, but because of how it reshaped behavior over time. The prisoners did not need to understand a rule to follow it. They only needed to recognize that it would remain. And in a place where so little could be predicted, that realization altered the rhythm of daily life more than any spoken order ever could. If the coffee unsettled the prisoners, the reaction of the guards unsettled them even more. Authority, as they had known it, always revealed itself through correction. Rules were enforced visibly. Limits were announced. Deviations were addressed without delay. In the American camps, this expectation went unanswered. The guards were present during every meal. They stood near the walls, moved slowly between tables, and observed the routine with calm attention. Yet they did not intervene. They did not signal when a cup should be put down, and they did not react when it was refilled. Their silence remained consistent, day after day. This restraint was difficult to interpret. In the prisoner's experience, allowance was always conditional. Resources were given temporarily, only to be withdrawn later as a reminder of control. Here, however, nothing suggested that the coffee was being monitored or measured. The guards did not use the coffee as leverage. They did not comment on how much was taken or how often cups were refilled. There were no warnings issued quietly and no punishments delivered later. The routine continued as if this detail required no oversight at all. For the prisoners, this absence of correction created uncertainty rather than relief. Without visible enforcement, they were forced to decide for themselves what behavior was acceptable. Each refill became a personal choice rather than a response to authority. Some men watched the guards closely, searching for signs of disapproval that never appeared. A glance, a pause, or a shift in posture was examined for meaning. Yet the guards offered no indication that limits existed, hidden or otherwise. Over time, the consistency of this behavior became harder to dismiss. The guards did not change their approach from one day to the next. They did not test the prisoners, nor did they attempt to provoke restraint. Their neutrality suggested that the system did not depend on constant supervision. This realization challenged deeply ingrained habits. The prisoners had learned to survive by responding to pressure, by anticipating correction before it arrived. Here, pressure was replaced by expectation alone. Some men continued to regulate themselves strictly, even in the absence of enforcement. They limited their own intake, not because they were instructed to, but because restraint felt safer than assumption. Others gradually accepted that no response would follow and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The guards remained unchanged throughout this process. They neither rewarded compliance nor punished excess. Their role appeared fixed, defined by observation rather than reaction. In this environment, control was not asserted through visible force. It was maintained through routine, repetition, and the quiet assumption that the prisoners would adapt on their own. The coffee did not symbolize generosity or indulgence. It symbolized a system that refused to explain itself. For men accustomed to understanding authority through action, this absence of correction demanded a different kind of adjustment. It required patience, interpretation, and a willingness to accept that not every rule would be announced or enforced in familiar ways. By the time the prisoners began to accept this reality, the routine had already taken hold. The guard's silence had become as predictable as the coffee itself. And in a place defined by uncertainty, predictability proved to be one of the most powerful forms of control. As the weeks passed, the presence of coffee no longer stood out as something unusual. What had once demanded caution gradually blended into the background of daily life, becoming part of a routine that no longer required conscious attention. The cups appeared, were filled, and were cleared away with the same quiet regularity as everything else inside the camp. Mornings unfolded without hesitation. Prisoners took their seats, reached for their cups, and drank without pausing to observe reactions or search for meaning. The careful calculations that had once shaped every movement faded, replaced by habits formed through repetition rather than trust. The coffee no longer felt like an allowance. It felt expected, not because it had been promised, but because it had never been taken away. This shift was subtle but significant. When something continues without interruption, it reshapes behavior without announcement. The prisoners did not decide to accept the routine. They simply adapted to it one day at a time. Conversations during meals became more relaxed, though still restrained. Silences no longer carried the same weight. The tension that had once surrounded every refill eased, replaced by an unspoken understanding that nothing would happen. Outside the dining hall, the camp maintained its steady rhythm. Work details were completed as assigned. Guards observed without comment. Evenings arrived and passed without incident. Nothing in the wider structure suggested that this small consistency was temporary. For some prisoners, this predictability brought a quiet sense of stability. Not comfort, and certainly not freedom, but a reduction in uncertainty. Knowing what would happen next, even in small ways, allowed them to move through their days with less constant vigilance. For others, the repetition carried a different weight. The absence of disruption made time feel slower, as if days were stretching into one another without clear boundaries. The routine did not challenge them physically. It challenged them by removing urgency. The coffee became a marker of time rather than an event. Morning was defined by its presence. The day moved forward once the cups were emptied and cleared away. In this way, something ordinary helped structure time inside a place where the future felt distant and abstract. What remained unchanged was the lack of explanation. No one ever explained why the coffee was available, why it continued without limit, or why it was treated as unremarkable. The prisoners learned to live with this absence of clarity, just as they had learned to live with many other unanswered questions. By the time the routine fully settled, the coffee had lost its power to surprise. It no longer symbolized confusion or uncertainty. It symbolized continuity. In captivity defined by repetition, continuity became a form of control, not through restriction, but through predictability. The days passed quietly, shaped by routines that no longer demanded attention, but still shaped behavior in ways the prisoners could not ignore. And so, without ceremony or explanation, the coffee became part of the camp's invisible structure. A small detail, repeated often enough to disappear into normality, quietly reshaping how time itself was experienced behind the wire. For the men held inside these camps, captivity in America was shaped less by dramatic events than by small, repeated details. Coffee was one of those details. It did not arrive with explanation, and it was never announced as a privilege or a test. It simply remained. What unsettled the prisoners was not the drink itself, but the consistency behind it. Day after day, the cups were filled without comment, and nothing followed. No rule was clarified. No condition was imposed. The routine continued, unchanged, in an environment where survival had once depended on anticipating limits. This absence of correction demanded a quiet adjustment. The prisoners learned to stop waiting for withdrawal. They learned to accept repetition without understanding its purpose. Over time, the coffee ceased to represent confusion. It became part of the structure of the day, marking the passage of time rather than raising questions about intent. Morning began with it. The day moved forward without disruption. This quiet consistency reshaped behavior without force, not through generosity and not through punishment, but through predictability. The system did not demand trust. It required adaptation. For many prisoners, this form of captivity proved more difficult to interpret than hardship ever had. There was no clear moment to resist, no visible pressure to endure. Instead, there was routine, repeated often enough to feel permanent. In the end, the coffee was never the story. It was simply a small, ordinary part of a larger system that governed life without explanation. And in a place where nothing dramatic happened, the ordinary became the most powerful force of all. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.